and write in bits necessary to explain it. So that was how the company was working. And they had, of course, a custom-built theatre by this time. The early theatres you often adapted in yards, and if they went around the country, they were travelling around, they performed one of the great inns of the town. They'd make an agreement to the landlord, set up a makeshift stage there and move on. If they were lucky, they'd get a place in one of the noble houses. I don't know if you have time to go in. What were your plans? Have you got anywhere like Hampton Court, Windsor Castle, anywhere like that? This time, probably not. But they'd have, anyway, you see the big dining hall with a dais at the end of a high table, screen behind it, kitchen, very convenient. And on those patterns, they eventually built theatres for the purpose. The first one in London, going back a bit now, was 1576, simply called the Theatre. The Theatre, from the Greek pattern. Greek name rather, not pattern. Now, that was just north of the city. How long have you been here? Just quite recently arrived.
This is our 2 days. This is our 3rd day.
I don't have any concept of London at all, but out further east there, you come to the city, the old part, Shakespeare's part. And just north of that, just outside the walls, was built the theatre, and was also the Curtain theatre as well. And Shakespeare's early work seems to be sort of wandering around between these two. But I'll come later on to I'll talk about the Globe, I think, a bit later. But they had regular theatres by this time, and usually owned by sort of impresario. The Chamberlain's men were unusual because they had their own theatre. But very often, the theatre was just a business, and when you went in the theatre, you dropped a penny into a box inside. That was your basic admission, standing in the yard. And if you wanted to go and sit on a rather uncomfortable bench, you'll see them with the Globe later on, you paid a bit more. No box offices or anything like that, no tickets. You paid your way. And the arrangement was, you see, that normally the actors took the basic penny. They got a penny for everybody who went in, wherever they went afterwards. And the owner of the theatre, or the housekeeper, took the rest. Now, the Chamberlain's men were rather different, but there was an example. There's a theatre, there was a theatre called the Swan Theatre, owned by Uncle Francis Langley, and he let it out to companies. I don't know, have you ever seen that picture? It's often in the Shakespeare books, of the Swan Theatre.
No.
Yes, yes. You know, it's the only actual contemporary drawing we have. It raises many questions it solves. But that was Langley's theatre, and that was, he would get those extra bits of money as they went in. Who was competitors was the question you asked. Well, I mentioned Green. Green was one of a group who called themselves the University Wits. They were young men who, the name suggests, had been at one of the universities, only two there, Oxford and Cambridge, and gone to London and began to make a living by writing. And there were, among them, there was, for instance, there was Lodge, Green, Lilly, and most of all, Marlowe. Are you with me? For Christopher Marlowe. I suppose Shakespeare's greatest rival, in a sense. They were born in the same year, 1564. Marlowe died in 1593. He was killed in a fight in a tavern, Deptford down the river. Almost certainly a political assassination. They hushed it up a lot. They claimed the inquest, it was a quarrel about the bill or the cheque, but he was pretty certainly an agent, you know, sort of CIA type, for the very efficient Francis Walsingham, who ran a kind of spy system. And he didn't do to double-cross Walsingham, which he may have tried to do. Anyway, that's neither here nor there. Marlowe died young, having left some splendid plays behind him. So that particular competition was removed. There was Ben Jonson, who actually acted with the Chamberlain, an actor as well. Jonson, without an H, heard of him? Comedies mainly. Friend and a bit jealous of Shakespeare sometimes, I think Jonson was, but they got all right. And later on, getting into the early 17th century, there were Beaumont and Fletcher, two writers. Francis Beaumont John Fletcher, who collaborated most of the time. We always think of, say, Beaumont and Fletcher like saying, Sears Roebuck or Marks and Spencer or something, but in fact they were individual people. And then later on, of course, again there was Webster towards the end of his career. So what I'm saying, but don't worry about all the names, but I'm saying is there was a lot of drama going on, shall we say. There were a lot of theatres coming up. There was continued demand for new plays. They didn't have long runs, as they do now. They were always putting on new stuff. And there was a big market for plays. And there were a lot of little-known writers, and some whose names we don't even know, but those were some of the principal ones. So he wasn't out on his own, in other words, you see. He had to draw them in to the theatre, and he obviously did. You know, what was social political climate, you asked? Yeah. Well, from what I've said, I think you can see there was a fairly well-controlled society. It was, by our standards, not pretty strict. It's almost despotic, but if you never know anything else, it's not so bad. Very hierarchical societies, that is, they believed very much in a regulated, stratified kind of society. The image of a great pyramid is sometimes used. There's a god at the top, and then the emperors and kings, and down the lords, commons, even right down, you see, to the animal kingdom, the vegetable and the mineral kingdom. It was all part of the system. And you were supposed to know your place within that. It was considered an offence, both morally and legally. Some to try to climb out of that, to get where you weren't meant to be. And that was quite important, because a word like ambition was a dirty word. Now today, to us, ambition, perhaps in your country even more than this, is on the whole a good thing. As long as it doesn't lead to nastiness and it can go wrong. But on the whole, you would say, well, you know, yeah, he's quite a nice kid, and he's really rather bright, but he doesn't seem to have any ambition. Well, just the opposite. At that time, Trump said, that's a very good young man, though. Unfortunately, I think he's ambitious. You know Julius Caesar?
Ambition.
Charge brought against their ambition. Ambition. And that's what Brutus plays upon in his funeral speech. He was ambitious. That's what Antony has to counter, you see, in his. Brutus says Caesar was ambitious. Sure, he's an honourable man. He has to fight that one back. And a late play, Henry VIII, Shakespeare makes Wolsey say, Cromwell, I charge thee, fling away ambition, by that sin fell the angels of the men, and the image which they could hope to rise by. So try to see that sort of society, where you were in your place, and that was it. But of course, in some ways, he had advantages that our modern dramatists haven't got. He had this very rigid society, but they had a lot in common. His audience, much more homogeneous than the modern audience. There'd be a shared faith, almost universally sharing the Christian faith, often quarrelling very nastily, even violently, about details, but that would be shared. Shared belief in this kind of structured, ordered society. Great belief in the power of the family. Now in Romeo and Juliet, you may remember how old Capulet gets very cross, doesn't he, with his daughter wanting to marry somebody else. It's accepted that the father's power was something then. You had to obey your old man, didn't say, oh, silly old daddy. But it was quite a defense not to. So yes, the power of the family, and the richer the family, of course, the more rights they would have over their children. Great national pride. This may not appeal to you with your history of unpleasantness because in the 18th century, it's like misunderstanding with Lord North. But try to think of England of Shakespeare as one that was newly unified, newly conscious of itself as a power, beginning to expand out to the west, following the tracks of Columbus, and flexing their muscles, you might say, really. The end of King John, well, little known history plays, but Falcom it says, as England never did and never shall stand at the proud foot of a conqueror, Since it went first, it helped to wound itself. Now these are princes that come home again. Come the four corners of the world in arms, and we shall shock them. Naught shall make us rue, if England to itself do rest but true. Now it's not going down terribly well with the young American audience today, but that's what it was to them. It was patriotism. It was good old England, and there's a lot of that going on.